Thank you, everybody. I hope you guys found the documentary interesting and informative. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First of all, we have Ms. Doris Liu. Ms. Doris Liu is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and a journalist based in Toronto, Canada. As a Chinese immigrant, she's passionate about telling compelling Chinese stories, ones that are rarely seen or rarely heard, but they are essential for the Western world to understand so that we can better understand the relationship between China and the West. She was also a former video journalist. Ms. Doris Liu has won the award for Best Multicultural TV Story for her insightful coverage of high-profile hate crimes against Asian anglers.
Mr. Phillips is an investigative journalist at Epoch Times, where he covers national security relating to China. He is an expert on hybrid warfare, including China's roles and approaches in espionage, organized crime, and various forms of unconventional warfare. He has won second place for Best News or Feature Series by the New York Press Association, where his investigative work into possible foreign influence over a former New York City comptroller. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Doris Liu and Mr. Joshua Philipp.
So now we're just going to have a quick discussion, asking a few questions, and then we'll open it up for you guys if you have any questions for Ms. Doris Liu and Mr. Phillips. So first of all, thank you guys both for coming all the way from Toronto and from New York City to join our event today. So I'd like to start off the conversation with a few questions, just so that the audience can kind of know you guys a bit more about your background and get to know you guys better. So firstly, for Ms. Liu, when did you first become aware of the problems surrounding the Confucius Institutes, and what drew you to make a documentary about this issue?
Right. That was back in early 2013. I read an article from Globe and Mail, which is a major newspaper in Canada, saying that McMaster University in Canada was closing down the Confucius Institutes because of the discriminatory hiring practices in Beijing, Hanban. So that caught my interest immediately because as a Chinese immigrant from mainland China and journalist covering Chinese diaspora and China-Canada relationship and Chinese people's status in Canada. So, and also I was a university teacher back in China. So those kind of things resonate to me deeply. So, but at that time, that was the first time I heard about there was serious problem around this cultural program. I never heard about any negative things before that. So I wanted to know what it's about. And other than this discriminatory hiring practice, is there any other problems surrounding this very good program? So I did a quick Google search and I found, to my surprise, so much controversy surrounding this. I didn't know that at all. And I wanted to find out more about that. So I wanted, and I thought to myself, okay, this is not a news piece. This should be something big. So I wanted to do a documentary and sharing with audiences my findings through the documentary. And so that was how I started to make this film. And lucky enough, I got some funding, a small funding from Canada Media Fund, which is a governmental funding. That financially allowed me to make this film, which you saw today. And I hope you enjoyed it and find it inspirational. Thanks.
Mr. Phillips, we were wondering if you could tell us more, or tell the audience more about your work at the Epoch Times, and a little bit about the organization, as well as whether or not you have any ongoing projects right now, as far as you're allowed to disclose.
Right, so I have an interesting job at Epoch Times. I work on national security, investigative journalism, but for several years, about 2008 to 2012, I was investigating Chinese infiltration and influence operations in the United States. And went very deep investigating the Chinese mafia, connections with the Mexican drug cartels, strong-arm tactics they were using against Chinese communities in the U.S. and in other parts of the world, how they force people to not speak up, the type of pressure they put on, say, students at universities, types of pressure that are on people's families. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. So based on your experience, do you think that the Confucius Institutes pose a serious national security or espionage threat to the U.S.?
Very much so, and it needs to be viewed in the full context.
Mm-hmm.
So the Confucius Institutes are one of one of several very similar programs. There's also the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, which are funded by the Chinese consulates and run by the Chinese consulates, and they do very similar operations.
Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so you have to understand the way the Chinese Communist Party's influence works. The Chinese Communist Party has latched its identity onto the identity of China itself. And it uses this kind of manipulation of the Chinese identity to push its influence. If you criticize the Chinese Communist Party, people feel because they've been filled with this so much of their lives that somehow you're attacking China. In reality, the Chinese Communist Party, communism was brought into China from Europe. Communism has caused more deaths in China than probably any ideology in history. Estimated between, 50 and 80 million people killed by Mao Zedong, depending on who you ask. The Chinese Communist Party continues to suppress the Chinese people. The Chinese Communist Party destroyed the Chinese culture as much as it could during the Cultural Revolution and similar movements. But it hides this history. It tries to convince the world that it somehow represents the interests of the Chinese people, when in reality the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party are the Chinese people. And so when it goes into other countries, it tries to present this image that it represents Chinese interests, and it presents, it plays on Western sentiments. In the West, we like the idea of diversity and freedom of belief and these things and tolerance. The Chinese Communist Party plays on our sentiments when it comes into these countries, and it says, look at this grand Chinese culture. Look at all the good things we've done. And I think especially in the academic community, people are more open-minded. People want to be accepting, and unfortunately, they're a lot more easily deceived by that, and they don't realize they're letting into their school or their community sometimes programs that are specifically designed to suppress the voices of the Chinese students, to suppress the rights of the Chinese students, sometimes even threatening families of Chinese students back in China if they speak out, say, for democracy or human rights. And also, they want to use them for different, state-run programs, such as right now there's the 2025 program that was recently exposed, and this is the Chinese Communist Party trying to obtain specific forms of intellectual property to bring back to China to overcome the United States specifically by 2025. This was recently exposed, and there was also a similar program that the United Front Department is involved in this, and this is also the Chinese state-run program designed specifically to infiltrate Chinese communities around the world, and tied to all kinds of stuff as well. Some of my work has gone into.
Mm-hmm. All right, it's interesting. So how would you say that this is different from other Western cultural centers, such as the British Council or the Alliance Française?
Right. As the documentary mentioned, first off, a lot of these are not funded directly by the governments themselves. And even when they are, or if they are, which I don't think we have any evidence of, they don't engage in the suppression of what can be taught. If an American, say, financed university goes to China, they're not going to prevent people from speaking about certain topics. Mm-hmm. If, let's say, as a similar example, imagine if a American university went to Canada and said, you can no longer hire Muslims, right? Mm-hmm. How do you think people would react? I think somehow we have these different systems of values that we apply, and I don't know why people do this, to be honest. And, Yeah.
I have points to add to this. You're asking a very important question. It's about what is the differences between the Confucius Institutes and the other cultural promotional organizations like Alliances Françaises or British Council, right, and Goethe Institute. The major two differences are, one, Confucius Institutes, as Joshua mentioned, is controlled by the Chinese government, which is not independent. Like the funding, the hiring, and the textbooks are all coming from the Chinese government through Hanban, which is under Education Ministry. Two, the Confucius Institutes are not physically independent. It's, I believe it's strategically designed as attached to the established Western universities and colleges and educational institutions, which means, like you saw in a film, McMaster University, it was the Confucius Institute was hosted by the humanitarian department or school, so so that the Confucius Institutes become one part of the Western universities. So for students who enrolled in the program, they just take it as part of the university, your own university. Say if Harvard has a Confucius Institute, then it would be part of Harvard. So this is very, I believe, as the critics pointed out, the main purpose of this model, attached or embedded model, is to borrow the prestige of the Western universities to pretty much profile, like you saw in the film, the image of Confucius Institutes. And two, it saves the Chinese government some money. You don't have to rent or buy a property or premise in foreign countries. So it's easy to start. You already have campus. You already have a body of students there. And you have the host institutions only need to provide an office for the Chinese instructors, provide some computers, help them to get visa coming into your country, and settle down, rent some houses for the Chinese staff, and insurance just facilitate. You don't need to pay for the Chinese staff. Everything is paid by the Chinese government. So that is the very big differences between these CIs, we call for short, Confucius Institutes, CI, and other cultural organizations.
Right. So building on that, so given that CI is here, a point that you're trying to that you talked about, implicit to like both of your sort of answers, is that China is using these institutes to push their own agenda. How impactful do you think that sort of like alleged, propaganda spreading really is in the context of a democratic society where other ideas are just as pronounced? Like, it's one thing for the Chinese government to push a certain narrative in China where there's only one narrative. So do you think the fact that it is in like a liberal Western democracy has a dampening effect on that, or like takes, the sharpness off the edge of that sort of, action?
I think
because like say I'm in a Canadian university and I go to Confucius Institute and they tell me some things about that are certainly in the views of the Chinese government. I can always go to someone else who has an opposing view who can give me like reorient myself, right? So
I think we can look at things like this. So first, there's no doubt that in the Confucius Institute textbooks or teaching materials, there are communist propaganda materials there. Like we saw in the film, there are lyrics in the songs praising the Mao Zedong, praising the Communist Party, and there are multiple choice texts which you have to choose Taiwan as a province of China, otherwise you lose the mark. There's a map on your back of the classroom which pointing the whole South China Sea as part of China and Tibet as well. So there's no doubt you are going to learn those information from at Confucius Institutes. And there's one example I can share with you. In one of the Canada's Confucius Institutes, the Confucius Institute director, who is actually representing Canadian University, but herself is a Chinese immigrant like myself, but she's a Canadian university faculty. So at one class, before the 2008 Beijing Olympic, when the Tibetans are uprising, so this Chinese Confucius Institute director pointed to a map of China saying Tibet belongs to China, and in future will belong to China. And she mobilized her students to rally against the Canadian media, saying they had lied on the reports on Tibet. So it ended up one major Canadian TV broadcasters put up an apology on the screen saying they apologized for their reports on Tibet. So that was documented on the Chinese, popular Chinese author, like writers online forum. So that give you an extreme example how that kind of propaganda materials could do to the students and your academia community. And two, I think I agree with the powerful effect that languages could play on our human brain. I studied education in Canada. One course discusses the language. So language can channelize and shape our thinking and our brain, actually. That's the science. So that means whatever languages you take in, it will play right on your brain. Like how you think of things, like your mentalities. It's not like you take a bad apple and you get sick tomorrow or tonight. It's not that direct effect. But eventually, throughout the time, if you keep taking this information, and you will kind of like you will play on your brain, and like you saw the students from University of Michigan who was dressed nicely, singing a vocal song. That song is praising Mao Zedong and Communist Party, right? Saying it's like a mother, but he is a university student, like you guys, and didn't he know what he was singing? So that's a very good example how those information would play. And on top of propaganda, there's also censorship, right? You mentioned, if we hear one narrative here, but we have opportunity to hear some other perspective over there. But what if Confucius Institute don't allow you to discuss that? And more worsely, even worse, what if the host institutions decided to, this topic is not going to make our Chinese partner happy. We're not going to discuss that at all. Like, we're not going to do a memorial to the 1989 Tiananmen incident.
Has that happened before?
Yes, there's an abundant, I think it's numerous incidents, evidences, where the host institutions canceled the Dalai Lama talk on campus, or they canceled an art exhibition depicting the plight of Falun Gong practitioners in China. And actually, in Israel, there was a court ruling, which is very hard evidence. It's about Tel Aviv University. Back in 2008, there was an art exhibition on campus. It was about Falun Gong development in China. And 3 days after the art exhibition, it was canceled. It was closed. It was scheduled for 2 weeks on-campus exhibition, but 3 days closed. And it ended up, it was because the Chinese embassy officials visited in person to the professor's office and literally threatened to the professor, if you let the art exhibition keep going, you're going to lose money, the Chinese money, and perhaps your Israeli students studying in China may suffer. So the professor worried about their own students studying in China, so he decided, okay, we're going to cancel it. But the students who organized the art exhibition took this to a local court, and the next year, 2009, the court ruled this university bowed to a foreign government and the freedom of speech sacrifices. So the court ruled the university reopen this art exhibition and give it the rest of the days it was scheduled but couldn't. So that was a very hard evidence about what the Confucius Institutes could bring to you.
A couple other points that should be mentioned. So the Chinese Communist Party views ideology as extremely important. In fact, one of the military programs of the People's Liberation Army is what they call the three warfares. The three warfares are psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare. Psychological warfare is altering the way a person interprets information. You want to say, on a battlefield, you want to demoralize your opponents. You want to make them question whether they're fighting on the right side or not. It's propaganda and whatever else. But this is mostly targeted at civilian populations. It's altering the way people interpret China, altering the way people interpret human rights, altering the way they interpret any issue the Chinese Communist Party is trying to push. Media warfare is controlling news outlets, but not just news outlets, maybe influencing them. It's very easy to alter the news narrative. If you're the Chinese Communist Party, you can just have, say, an influential, say, former government official call up a news outlet and tell them that article you published was offensive to the Chinese people, and I'm offended that you wrote that. And the journalist is going to write back and say, oh, I didn't mean to offend you. I'm not racist, I promise. Something, right? And then person's going to say back, it's okay, Westerners, you don't understand China. Let me tell you what's really going on. The person's going to bow down, and everything they say is going to be accepted from that point on. It's extremely easy to influence media coverage. Mm-hmm. And then legal warfare is a manipulation of, and by the way, media warfare is not just news. It's also, say, social media and things like that, like the 50 Cent Army, the Chinese paid troll armies that go online and publish, say, comments on websites and stuff. Mm-hmm. Legal warfare is a manipulation of legal systems. You want to keep issues from moving forward. You can file lawsuits that drag out issues forever in court. You keep it in court. You make it never leave the court, or you give the illusion that something is controversial when it's not really controversial. Mm-hmm. And it's also important to understand a bit on how. I know you asked it before, but I didn't go deep enough into it, how maybe these systems actually work. So it's important to understand how the Chinese Communist Party tries to control foreign communities, especially Chinese communities. And so in traditional China, ancient China, of course, the lowest form of government was a county magistrate. There was no government below that. Below that, it was mostly, say, hometown associations, family associations, tongs, different types of, say, guilds and things like that. When Chinese people immigrated to other countries, they maintained these same sorts of governance. So you have, say, in New York, we have the Shandong Association. There's the, say, Oil Workers Association in Texas. Right? Every type of business will have a different, say, society that works on a certain issue. There's going to be family name associations and so on. When the Chinese Communist Party launched its United Front program, it was to expand the influence of the Chinese Communist Party within the diaspora of Chinese communities abroad. And so they sent delegates through the consulates to go meet with, say, the heads of these different tongs and associations that control the Chinese communities. They try to get them to, say, switch their allegiance from being independent or pro-Hong Kong or pro-Taiwan or whatever they are, to supporting the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And it gives them different, say, financial incentives, or maybe their family in China will do better in some way. One of the most common ways is to launder money to them. Let's say you'll start an import-export business with China. Let's say you buy $1 million worth of goods, they'll charge you $500,000. So they're technically giving you $500,000. It's never going to show up on the US books. It's only going to show up on the Chinese books. There's no way you could possibly track it. And so through this, they start to gain control of the Chinese communities. These leaders control the Chinese communities. And when people start stepping out of line, one interesting thing about the hometown associations is a lot of them also work with the Chinese mafia. And so in my own work, I encountered this quite a bit. They were threatening to kill me, threatening to kill a lot of people I was talking to. And one of my contacts, they threatened to chop one of his hands off, for example. Very common, and the type of persecution that Chinese people in America, as we speak, are under right now that is not being addressed. They will mobilize these people to strong-arm, threaten, hold of protests, you name it, right? It's even worse in places like Taiwan and Hong Kong. I've heard of journalists getting axes in the back. In Taiwan, I think there's a guy that calls himself the White Wolf. He's a convicted human trafficker and extortionist who does these types of things. And he's allowed to operate openly. And so this whole system is mobilized to control the Chinese communities, to censor the Chinese people, to prevent discussions from taking place at universities, to track you, to know you, to threaten your family, you name it. And there's another department that works alongside the United Front Department called the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. The OCAO regards second and third generation Chinese as Chinese citizens. And it will keep tabs on every single Chinese person. It's a racial targeting department.
How much longer do you think this type of control could go on kind of semi-successfully, or could keep going until you're going to get more and more dissent and more people are going to start protesting, or other countries are going to start realizing what is really happening and start taking control?
So two big problems that are happening right now. One is that most Westerners cannot get into the Chinese communities. They have no way of understanding the Chinese communities.
Right.
I've met a lot of people in law enforcement who told me this. They don't understand the way Chinese communities work. When they do try to interact with the Chinese communities, the leaders of the Chinese communities work for these systems. And oftentimes, Chinese people, new immigrants, they don't know how to navigate the American system or the systems of whatever countries they're in. They come from a country where they don't believe the government represents their interests. They're still kind of afraid of the police and things like that. It's very common that they still feel pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are still afraid to speak out because they have family back in China. And so this whole system kind of prevents this from being revealed, which is why I think it is important to educate local leaders, the government, on what's actually going on. Because until they start knowing what's actually taking place and understanding what's actually at play, there's nothing they can do about it.
Right.
I just want to give you the example of what Joshua, you saw in the film, the people who came out to support the Confucius Institutes, most of them are still Chinese immigrants. And those are people, pretty much like Joshua mentioned, paid by the Chinese consulate of Toronto, and invite them to come out to support. And the leader of those supporters, I saw them are Chinese supermarket, very big supermarket chain in Toronto, the owner of that business, who came from Fujian. And another so-called leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese community, she was the chairman of the Chinese Professional Association of Canada. She actually just literally 2 months before she showed up to support the Confucius Institute, she just came back from Beijing, being awarded by the Chinese government as an excellent or outstanding Chinese community leader by that Office of Overseas
Overseas Chinese Affairs.
Chinese Affairs Office, right? By that organization, which is a parallel with the United Front, which is also both identified by the intelligence community as spy agents of Chinese government. So that's just give you an example, a vivid example.
These departments are known as what you call overt spy agencies. So
Yeah,
they are
yeah.
recognized in the intelligence.
Right. And more broadly, we saw the protesters and the supporters came out, but more Chinese people, I mean the Chinese Canadian people, they like so-called majority, silent majority, they feared of coming out to express their either opinion, because they even though they live in Canada, a free society, they still feel the Chinese government, the Communist Party, is following them, watching them. Like, I can share another example. Sonia Zhao, the main character in my film, personally experienced while she was teaching at McMaster University. She was hired by Hanban together with two other classmates. So 3 girls were sharing one house in that city, the Canadian city. And one day, they all taught at McMaster University's Confucius Institutes. So one day, the 3 colleagues or 3 girls, they rented a DVD movie called 7 Years in Tibet, starring Brad Pitt. So they were watching that and shockingly found the movie told them information they never taught back in China, which was the People's Liberation Army actually invaded Tibet and killed a lot of Tibetan people and Tibetan Lama if they refused to be led by the Chinese Communist Party. So the 3 girls next day were discussing this movie in their CI office, but literally was stopped by their director, Chinese directors, who was saying, if you keep discussing the movie like this, and you were going to write self-criticism reports while you go back, return in China. So none of the 3 girls dared discussing this any longer. So yeah, like Sonia told me while I interviewed her, that even though I was in Canada, but because I worked inside Confucius Institutes, I was required to follow the Communist Party line. Even my thoughts could not go right with that. So that gave you another example, how the fear playing here and control.
Right. But to take the discussion back towards the Confucius Institutes, surely there were people who came out because they truly thought like, learning about the Chinese culture in those institutes was a good thing, right? So do you think there would be any way in which, or what changes do you think should be made towards
what?
The CI Institute system for it to continue adding value to the American community? Or is it completely unsavable? Like, what is your opinion? Do you think that there is a way in which these institutes can exist within Western communities?
I can share one very recent development in America. There are a few lawmakers, like the House of Representatives, they tabled draft proposal, which aimed to target any foreign funding coming into the American universities and campuses as foreign agents. So they didn't single out Confucius Institutes, but it was believed the goal of this proposal was targeting Confucius Institutes by addressing the true nature of this program, which is Chinese government's founding. It's not part of American university, and which says, I think we are an open and free society. We welcome everything. If you're coming here, do your thing. You have the freedom to do your propaganda. But at least we need to know you are a foreign force. You are not part of us. So that's the first step. And
so like a recognition that it is funded by the Chinese
government. Right. It has to change this model, like attachment model. So it has to be an independent entity running their own things. That's the first step. And I think there's always discussion about where we take Chinese language or culture education. Is the Confucius Institute the only options? I think the answer is no, right? If the Confucius Institute is going to do propaganda, censorship, and trigger or encourage self-censorship, I think that is totally against the values we should protect. So I think to answer the question, if we want to take goodness of the Confucius Institutes, but don't get rid of the badness. So first, independent, and second, perhaps we need to renegotiate the agreement with Hanban so that we can make sure academic freedom, integrity, all the values are protected and respected and not violated.
And I think maybe the last question before we open it up to the audience, you talked about these changes that can be made in order for the Confucius Institutes to be have a bit more of a positive presence. Do you think these changes are possible, and or will they really harm relationships between China and for example, the U.S. or with Canada? Will they change any other aspects or maybe harm the relationship between the two nations?
I think we make judgments according to the history of one person's, the history of one person. So if we want to foresee the future of Confucius Institutes, we have to make that judgment based on its history. So its history, as far as I can see, the McMaster University closure sent us a very clear message, which is the Chinese government is not going to change its way of doing things. The real reason McMaster University closed the Confucius Institute was because the Hanban, Chinese government, refused to rescind that discriminatory clause from the hiring contracts. So McMaster University literally spent over a year trying to negotiate and discuss with the Chinese partners. You just get rid of that, and we want to have Confucius Institutes on campus. We want to have that Chinese language program, but it failed. So what I can see from that is example is Chinese government is not going to change its way of thinking and doing things, and that's their purpose to change the whole world, I think.
And I would add to that too. The biggest problem is that it would eliminate competition with, say, if normal, say, regular people from the grassroots level wanted to, say, start a Chinese language program in a university and already had a deal with the Confucius Institute. That university is not just getting, say, a free program or even paying money for teachers to come in and teach something. They're getting money from a foreign government to come in and teach it. They're being supplied with free teachers, free materials, sometimes even free facilities being built. And so how do you compete with that if you're just a normal person on the street? It eliminates the possibility, I think, of, let's say, independent Chinese teachers going to these universities.
Yeah, or the private schools.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you both very much. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, like at the back.
I'm doing research on democracy and freedom of speech at Harvard Kennedy School. And how to put this? There's a big difference between propaganda and professional journalism. As for me, propaganda means that you select information to make people believe what you believe, and the freedom of speech, or at least professional journalism, means fair and balanced, criteria. So I noticed several things being, ignored within this documentary. Things like, because I did a field survey of Confucius Institutes in New Zealand and Australia in 2012. I'm not sure what they are now, but I'm quite familiar with the situation in 2012 there. So firstly, there are a lot of students, local students, Australian students and New Zealand Kiwi students, rather than the Chinese immigrants. And I would very much to know about the Canadian, the non-Chinese immigrant Canadian students at the Confucius Institutes. And because, their ideas, their feedback, their feeling is very crucial for me to understand the role of Confucius Institutes. And secondly, I'm not an expert in cross-cultural organization or Institute of Scientists, things like that. But I googled just now, and I found that the Institute of Scientists also censored the speech in favor of the independence of Catalonia in Netherlands in 2014. So a comparison of this kind of public institutions or intercultural or language institutions between Confucius Institutes and the Institute of Scientists, are they really so different? Are they really so different because this is an institute initiated by a totalitarian regime or a communist party, and that is from a democratic government? Are they really so different? Because if they are not so different, our perception of Confucius Institute or our perception of Institute of Scientists might be different. And thirdly, there's a very smart, trick in this, because after you displayed the protest of the Chinese students, there followed a Canadian who announced that they received money for this, and also during our talk, you mentioned the one who owned this supermarket chain got awarded from the Communist Party. I can tell that this is all true, but I have many friends who voluntarily attended those anti-Tibet independence movement in Paris in 2008, and they do it from their own idea without any pension or money. And as for me, they are the Chinese people.
Have you got any question?
Yeah. So, okay, my conclusion is that this documentary looks more like a propaganda rather than a fair, balanced professional journalism production. So if you improve and add those elements within this documentary, this may increase your credibility of the documentary. And the one last sentence, I'm not an expert on Tibet, and I don't know the idea of Tibetan people, but Dalai Lama did announce he is not seeking the independence of Tibet, and you can find this news on Fox News with a video. Yeah, okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, first of all. I think I wanted to ask the rest of the audiences, do you think it's a propaganda piece or journalism? How many people think it's agree with this gentleman?
How about you answer?
I suppose the question is, like, do you feel like you were trying, there was an attempt to push a certain agenda or a certain idea with the filming of the propaganda, or was it, do you think you were completely holistic and like portraying the entire picture when you were making the documentary?
I think at least I was trying to balance like the both sides, as you can see from the film. So trying to approach those who welcome Confucius Institutes and those who don't welcome or rejected Confucius Institutes, but oftentimes, unfortunately, it was the people who against the Confucius Institutes are very willing to open up for the discussion and state their cause, and they all value Chinese language and culture study, but at the same time, they criticize the Confucius Institutes harshly. But unfortunately, the other side who support the Confucius Institutes, oftentimes they don't want to give you a reaction to the other side. As you saw from the film, I pressed those CI supporters for an answer to the criticisms, and eventually they just walked away. And that says a lot to, it is not like they didn't know about that, those criticisms or concerns exist. They knew that, they just don't want to frankly react to those viewpoints, and they just turn a blind eye. And actually that was the most difficult thing of me making this documentary, because they just refused to talk to you, and what could you do? I was trying to, my plan, because of the budget limit, my plan was to get access to the 5 major Confucius Institutes in Ontario, the province of Ontario and province of British Columbia, where the most Chinese diaspora are living. And then for the rest of 7 Confucius Institutes in Canada, I was trying to just email them and speak, like phone interview them. But I literally only got 2 physical access to those 12 Confucius Institutes, which were all presented one university even didn't end up in the film because of the storytelling thing. But you saw that school, right? I interviewed 2 white female, they walked away. And another university in province of Ontario, I originally scheduled 2 days of filming, but after the first day filming, they sent me an email asking me to sign a so-called media consent, which gives the university rights to pre-screen any interview content and withdraw any if they feel not happy about. But of course, we could not sign that. I could not sign that. I could not give up my editorial rights. I didn't sign that. They didn't ask me early on. They sent to me after my first day filming, because I asked them some so-called sensitive questions, and then they felt something. And then they asked me to sign that, and I refused, and as a result, they canceled the second day filming. So that says a lot. And then after that, I went to the the school boards in Vancouver, where I interviewed the 2 white female. And actually, while I was doing the interview, the Chinese director, the director of Confucius Institute, who was sent by the Chinese government, was filming me interviewing the 2 colleagues. Using her phone. And even before the interview, she told me she would record and send the interview back to Hanban. I understand. Wow. That was their tasks. And for any media present, they have to report back to the government. And then, of course, because the interview broke up that way, and I can only imagine she reported back to Hanban saying this Doris is doing something where it's not going to be happy. We're not going to be happy. And actually, after that interview, I couldn't get any access to any other Confucius. So that's the biggest challenge. I'm trying to invite you to tell your thing. You don't want to talk about that.
It's important to note, too, that there are other independent studies that have been done on the Confucius Institutes that have found very similar things. I think the National Association of Scholars or something like that did a similar study, and they concluded as well. They actually recommended that all universities get rid of their Confucius Institute programs.
Right.
In their conclusion.
Yeah, that's
based on pretty much her exact same findings.
Right.
Yeah,
The author of the report is outsourced to China. It's a New York City-based, I think it's a think tank. So the author of the report visited 13 Confucius Institutes in New Jersey and New York.
Right.
And in one extreme cases, she was armed, literally armed, by the Confucius Institute staff, and escorting her out of the Confucius Institute classrooms. Even after she got that permission to visit the classroom, she was still treated that way. And she was warned, never come back to our campus again. So just imagine that happened on our campus, land. But I think you can make your own judgment. What's the nature of the Confucius Institute, and what are the risks or even dangers this program could bring to your campus, your community, your society, and your nation.
And just on the, you mentioned the paid protesters. That's actually a very common phenomenon with these groups. Doesn't mean all of them are paid. You're going to have people who show up just because, their friends are going and such.
Right.
But the people organizing it are usually doing it under directives.
Right. Yeah.
And the immediate, I'd say, main groups are usually paid.
Right.
There was a good Stratford report, I think in 2008, on some of the protests he mentioned. It talked about this.
Sorry, we'd like to take one more question.
Yeah.
Sorry. All right, how about you? Yes.
First of all, I'd like to commend you on a wonderful documentary. I thought your interview, all I know about the Toronto School Board is what I saw tonight in your film. And I thought your interview with the head of the school board there was really brilliant. And as I was watching that, knowing nothing else, my first reaction is, this guy must be getting a kickback. You really exposed, I think, him quite well. I did have a minor quibble from film perspective, and I was a little uncomfortable with the recreation of the story of the woman, which I felt went a little into docudrama and away from pure drama. But when I saw the notice of the screening tonight, I did a few minutes research, and I was curious as to how many institutes there really were. It was just staggered to find out. The best source I could find on the internet was a site called Dig Mandarin, which just lists Chinese language programs everywhere. And I was quite astonished by by some of the universities in the United States which had bought into it. These were really wealthy universities that have endowments that can do their own programs and don't need this kind of thing. And one of the ones I found was Stanford. And so I actually went to the Stanford University website and downloaded the Department of East Asian Language and Cultures. And what they say about the Institute, first of all, they open up with a ni hao, welcome to the Confucius Institute at Stanford. Now this is done by Stanford University, not the CI. And then they say about the Institute, under the directorship of Richard Sallier, that's how you pronounce his name, and he's the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences, and administered by the Department of East Asia Language and Cultures. The Confucius Institute at Stanford focuses on research, blah, 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 blah. But in your experience, are there universities that have contracts with the Confucius Institutes and then exercise control, oversight over what the program does? Because from the official Stanford website, I didn't have time to go into a whole bunch of others, but it sounds as if they actually exercise the same controls that they would apply to anyone teaching at their university. I'm just puzzled by that in the light of what your documentary alleges.
Right. Stanford University got $4 million US just as a starting money. 4 million. And I think for every Confucius Institute on their website, they will say we have full total control of the curriculums going on in our institution, and even in organizational in the organization of the Confucius Institute, we have some of them. They have steering council, or they have a council to oversee its specific Confucius Institutes, and the member of the council, half of the member are from the Chinese partner, half of the member are from the host institution. They say we have discussion about our daily operations, and we have control. That's what I say. But I can tell you one example, at least in France, in Paris, the University of Lyon 2 and 3, they had an Confucius Institute, but they closed in later 2013. I think it's the second university to close the CI. And the reason was the French director says Hanban has becoming more and more impatient about the university, Lyon University's independent using of choosing textbooks and teaching materials in their Confucius Institutes. And Hanban even sent a new Chinese director to that Confucius Institute and imposing the French university using Hanban textbooks. And after being refused, Hanban from Beijing directly pressured the French university, and that eventually caused the closure of the CI, because the French university couldn't bear that any longer. So perhaps you can say it's just one incident or one example, but I see from this in cases the nature of Hanban, and more broadly the nature of the Chinese government and Communist Party. They were trying to impose by every means their rules.
Yeah, let me just clarify. I'm a strong supporter of the umbrella movement and the sunflower movement, and actually hosted the student leaders when they were here and got to know them and kept in touch with them. So I'm not a friend of the Chinese government, but it's just curious to me that a place like Stanford could really, although having been at Harvard for decades, I hate to see what a documentary might turn up about some arrangements between Harvard faculty and Chinese government and foundations, and so that I think it's there are a lot of areas out there that a lot of us might feel uncomfortable about. Seth Moulton, by the way, who was our congressman one of our congressmen from Massachusetts, on March 18th, who was interviewed in the Boston Globe and did a scathing article about the Confucius Institutes. And I sympathize with the tax on journalists, because if you read the comments that follow, obviously it's full of fake news narratives and trolls and all kinds of people planted by opponents of his point of view and exaggerating, spreading misinformation. So it's a crazy field out there. But I am still, I remain worried about how it's possible that some of the universities listed, which are really elite universities that have plenty of funds to do whatever they want, except the institutes. One other thing, there was a scene in there where the children were singing.
Sir, could you answer the question?
And I just wanted to compliment you on that. It was just, absolutely riveting. It reminded me of films I've seen of Nazi youth singing German patriotic songs during the 1930s. I mean, that was really scary.
I think that varies how the Western universities react to the Confucius Institute's approaches. Actually, in Canada, all the top 3 Canadian universities don't have Confucius Institutes. In one of them, University of British Columbia in Vancouver, they rejected the Confucius Institute's approach at least for 4 times. And Hanban approached this top 3 Canadian university from different avenues, from different schools. But the University of British Columbia didn't take that deal. And in my interview, the head of Asia Studies, Professor Roskin, told me because they felt, one, the Confucius Institute deal is secret. The agreement is not open to public scrutiny. 2, there are strings attached to the Confucius Institute's deal. Actually, this university, they accepted money from Taiwan. Yeah, and I asked them why. It's also a foreign government's money, and he told me there's no strings attached to the Taiwan money. And they have Taiwanese teachers on campus as well. So that's just one example. I think there's more.
I think this
I
might.
believe this film very educational. It is necessary to send to our elect officials in United States, like governor, U.S. senators, U.S. congressmen. I believe why they review the film, they will take care of their business. This film, I'm a second time to view this film. So that's my suggestion.
Oh, thank you.
We'll take
One more, and then I think.
Yeah.
So thank you for organizing this, and I actually found, I've heard Doris speak before, we organized a screening at Kendall. The film was wonderful, but I really was impressed to hear all of your research and knowledge about how this all works in the bigger context. So thank you very much for being here. 2 things I think are really important. So I am Tibetan, I work on the Tibetan issue. We've been leading a campaign in coalition with many other Taiwanese, Buddhists, Chinese democracy activists, people of conscience against the Confucius Institute at UMass Boston, Cambridge Rinjin Latin's Confucius Classroom, and the Confucius Institute at Tufts University. I think one of the things that struck me the most as someone who had the benefit to grow up in a free and open society, I grew up in Canada and now gets to live here, one of the things that horrified me most when we dug into this campaign is the contract. The contract, that the agreements that the universities sign with the Confucius Institute, which is basically with the Chinese government, they give away academic freedom just like that. There's a clause in the UMass Boston contract, which we requested it from the university, but they made us go through the legal sort of public records request. Even though it's a public institution, we had to go that way. We got it after many, many weeks. And Article 5 says, you know, the institute, UMass Boston, Confucius Institute, must accept the decision of headquarters, as in Beijing, Hanban, for all academic matters. I mean, to me that is appalling. And I just can't believe it's not more controversial and it doesn't get more attention. So that's number 1. And number 2, or equally bad, the contract also says, and this is the standard language, London School of Economics, we saw their contract some years ago, same language. They also agree to follow the rules, the laws and regulations of the US and China. And I just don't see how that is even possible or legal. It doesn't pass the legal smell test as far as I'm concerned. And we're pretty sure Tufts and others all signed the same contract. Interestingly, Stanford did negotiate their contract, and they're one of the only ones to have done so. But I just think when you're being asked to do this, and also to keep the agreement confidential, and you're a publicly funded institution, it's unacceptable. From a basic principle of a free and open society, we should not accept this. The universities are doing it because, and I'm just going to be frank, they're doing it because they want to make the Chinese government happy and make sure all the staff and all the students get as much back and forth access to China, right? We all know the Chinese government controls access, and that's how you make people do what you want. I'm Tibetan, they do this with Tibet. If Tibetans are quiet and we don't say anything about the true situation in Tibet, we can go back. And if we do say anything, we're not allowed to go back. If a university takes a stand on any of these issues these days, they will punish you. And in the case of the University of Calgary, I think in Canada, they hosted the Dalai Lama's talk, and the Chinese government told them to stop, and when they didn't, they delisted them from the school that they recommend students in China go and attend abroad. Well, that's a lot of money. I figure UMass Boston has 1,000 foreign Chinese students, which is wonderful. That's roughly $33 million. You know, when the universities accept these, I think they're doing a deal with the devil, not, you know, the Chinese government and Communist Party alone. I think that this is something that is just, it's unacceptable. This is why we're fighting it. If you're interested, I can tell you more. I have flyers, I have petitions. I just, for so many reasons beyond just the Tibetan interest, obviously, that I have in human rights, I just think, the more I dig into this campaign, I'm appalled. And talk about little bits of intimidation and whatnot. You know, everybody who signed our original letter to UMass Boston now has been receiving strange calls in Mandarin from what appears to be the Chinese consulate in New York. Maybe it's not. The coincidence is, you know, it can't be a coincidence that all of our phones are receiving these calls, but that's okay, fine, it's not a big deal. Day before yesterday, we had a meeting with the senior UMass, the whole system executive. Only 7 of us knew about that meeting and the address of that meeting. It was at a private business. And while we were in that meeting, I found out last night, that same Chinese consulate message went to their voicemail of the architecture firm that we were meeting in. I mean, in the middle of our meeting, between 10 and 11, at 10:23 a.m., that place got this call that no one could know about except a few of us, rights and democracy activists, who met with this one UMass vice president. So it's crazy to me also, and I know the Chinese community gets this kind of harassment or intimidation. I know Tibetans from Tibet who live here certainly get that. It's one of the first times I'm coming up against it so directly, that someone cares so much about what we're doing on this campaign.
I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
It was great talking to you guys, learning about what you're working with and your opinions. Thank you all for coming. I hope you guys had an interesting time.
Yeah, thanks very much. And again, also thank you for sharing your experiences and giving us a little bit more knowledge, and also for your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for organizing this.